So hopefully you already viewed the first video on the perspectives on diagnosis and how counseling views diagnosing. So now let's talk about what is diagnosing. So this PowerPoint's in the same module. If you have a hard time with it, let me know. So as discussed in the introductory syllabus video, you need the DSM, and it's currently in its 5th edition. It came out in 2013, so we're already on its 7th year, right? And when you look at the times for when they come out, they're kind of all over the place, right? 2 came out in 52, and then 23 years later, or 1 came out in 52. The next one came out 23 years later. Then the third one came out 5 years later. Then the revised one came out 7 years later. Then we kind of have this long pause of 13 years, right? And so this is what we have. And the DSM is our tool for diagnosing. You can only diagnose what is in the DSM. Right? Meaning you might hear other like buzzword type things. If you remember a few years ago, there was, I think it was in Dallas, the very wealthy kid who got into a car accident and his therapist said he had affluenza, right? He had so much affluence in his family, he wasn't ready for it. And so that's why he did what he did. Affluenza is not a real thing. There was a running joke in 2011, 2012 that the DSM would contain something called selfie-itis, which is the obsession of taking selfies of oneself. That is not in there, right? We are limited to the diagnoses in the DSM the way that they are, right? It is compatible with ICD-11. This is a small detail that is important if you're doing insurance stuff or if you're working like in a hospital system. The ICD is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases, and that is like a very large document that has all the different ailments that one can have, including mental illness. And so when we examine the pieces of the DSM, I'll show you the codes. There's 2 numbers per diagnosis. One is the DSM code and the other is the ICD-11. And again, this is just a categorizing system. Don't sweat over this part. We'll go over it and knock it out real easy. So the DSM and I guess mental illness as a whole tries to be theoretically neutral, right? So think of the different counseling theories. And so a lot of the disorders, it's not, if they weren't neutral, then only some theories would recognize certain diagnoses. And that wouldn't be helpful. Many of the diagnoses in here are atheoretical, right? They don't exist in the context of a specific theory. The DSM also considers, as do professionals, the role of biology, right? That mental anguish, distress, and mental illness, or the disorders, can come about as a function or in conjunction with medical or biological problems. And conversely, you can have medical conditions that are comorbid with or made worse by a mental health disorder, right? They intertwine together, medical problems and mental health issues. So what is a mental disorder, right? So we talked about the 4 Ps already, right? Is there a problem, a pattern? Is it pervasive? Is it persistent? And so according to the DSM, a mental disorder is a syndrome, I'm paraphrasing what's on the screen, is a syndrome, also known as a collection of symptoms, or a pattern that an individual has that comes with distress or disability, or an increased likelihood of anguish, right? And it's not part of a culturally sanctioned response or practice. So again, with these, unlike medicine, where here's, the human body is the same regardless of the culture, right? You have this many bones and this many organs and et cetera, and, we can run these blood tests or do an x-ray or do a scan and see what's wrong. With this, though, there's inherently an element of subjectivity. And so we need to take into account age and stage, context, and culture, right? So that way we can prevent misdiagnosis or pathologizing normal behavior, right? So take, for example, right now, one of the big debates, we'll get to a little bit further in the semester, is video game addiction and internet gaming disorder, which it's in the back of your DSM if you want to check it out. Are we pathologizing gaming, right? And so in present day, gaming's a very big thing, right? We have professional gamers. Universities have esports teams, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so it's normal. It's part of the culture. However, there are cases where people got into problems or had anguish because of their gaming habits. So where's the line between pathologizing a normal behavior and identifying a problem, right? What we emphasize with counseling is people first, right? So I already went on in the previous video a lot about looking at the person as a whole, looking at the context, right? Age, stage, culture, etc. But also when we talk about individuals who have mental illness, we want to use what's called people first language, and I'm happy to see that so many students are already familiar with this, and this is one of the articles that's on this module. So instead of saying schizophrenic or my alcoholic client or my borderline my borderline friend or something like that, we would say my client with alcohol use disorder, my client with schizophrenia, he has schizophrenia, she has borderline, as opposed to identifying them by their diagnosis, right? And what we see is that this can help reduce stigma. It's also one of the things that ACA really emphasizes as a profession, that we put people first before their diagnoses. So with so many different diagnoses, we need a system for classifying. So some of you might be looking at this saying, you're already familiar with the Fiveaxis system, saying, why is he going over this? I thought we were done with it. No, we don't use it. So I want to be really clear. The Fiveaxis system, in theory, should be gone, right? It went away in 2013 when we got DSM-5. However, as of now, 2020, I still hear from former students and interns, and they went to work, and the place where they're working at still uses this Fiveaxis system. And that's not illegal or anything like that. It can be used as a form of documentation. Maybe they have an outdated computer system or filing system. But the DSM-5 states that it no longer requires, and nor did they ever apparently require, the Fiveaxis system. So in theory, you shouldn't see this as often. I want to go over this because I'd hate for you to go for a job interview or get a job and you're asked about your knowledge of this system and you don't have it. So I'd rather you have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So the Fiveaxis system is just this. The way we would make diagnoses is pretty much the way you see it on the screen. We would start with, here we go, Axis 1, right? This is all disorders except for personality disorders and intellectual disability disorder, what used to be called mental retardation. Axis 2 was only personality disorders and mental retardation, intellectual disability. So these two come from the DSM, right? You would be diagnosing these, or the client comes in and has a history and reports it. Your next line, Axis 3, general medical conditions, right, of note. So maybe someone on Axis 1, they have binge eating disorder. Down here, they have diabetes and overweight or obesity, right? We need to be aware of that. Someone might have depression here, thyroid issues here, right? But some kind of medical issue. And you would notate on there, right, what they give you, because you're not a physician. You're not making that medical diagnosis. You're making maybe these top two, but the medical one you would put by report or per physician, 4, this is us again, star. Psychosocial and environmental. So this is where you'd put things like relocation, trauma survivor, recently incarcerated, loss of job, loss of loved one, survivor of domestic violence, right? So these are issues that are relevant that are not diagnoses. So it's anything else they're dealing with, right? So child comes in and they're really upset because they're being bullied, right? Victim of bullying. And then we had this thing, which is also us, GAF, the Global Assessment of Functioning. So imagine you're an intern and I'm your supervisor, and you have a client, and you say, this person has anorexia and depression. I say, okay, and you got all this perfect. And then I ask you, on a scale of 1 to 100, how bad is your client? Or how good is your client? Give me a number. And that's what this was, right? There used to be, and you can still find them. I don't think we need to go that far into it, but there was a scale between 1 and 100 where you would assign your client a number. And this was how well they're functioning in the world. And it was supposed to be a snapshot of your client's ability to function with all this stuff going on. So how well they're doing at work, at home, things like that. So what do you think some of the problems were with this? So you probably correctly guessed that it was super subjective, right? Very, very subjective. You can only work with what your client gives you. I might be someone who I give a very low number. You might give a higher number. But the other thing is that it is a snapshot. You're making this assessment based on this momentary interaction. So it might be artificially high because they're having a really great day and the symptoms have abated somewhat. Or they might be having an exceptionally bad day, right? Because they got up on the wrong side of the bed. They spilt their coffee on themselves on the way to the session. They got into like a little fender bender, and so now they're all angry and upset, and so everything is worse. And the system itself was kind of funky to begin with too. A score of 80, right, which we would think 80 is not bad. 80 was, it said, the person has no problems at home, at work, at school, or interpersonally, and is a source of support that others go to for advice and guidance. So the fact that someone was going to counseling with you would mean they're less than 80, right? To put it in perspective, by the time you got down to 60, it requires inpatient hospitalization. And then I think 40 and lower would be things like they need 24-hour surveillance for risk of self-harm and things like that. So it wasn't very accurate. It wasn't consistent. So they've done away with it. And that is one less thing that we need to contend with. But you can still find the chart online. Maybe I'll post it on there if there's enough interest. I think there's a few websites where you can kind of play. I guess it's kind of a quiz or a game where they give a case study and you assign a number and you can see how far off you are from the population. Provisional diagnoses, right? So we all have to start somewhere. And so someone comes in and maybe they're a little reluctant to talk. You think they have a certain diagnosis, but you're not sure. You can give a provisional diagnosis, right? And that means pending more information, I think it's this diagnosis. I think the person maybe they come in and they say, I'm being mandated to counseling because I got a DUI. And you do your like addiction assessment, your substance abuse assessment, and the person says, I've just been having such a hard time. The only way I can cope is through drinking. Otherwise, I'm up all night worrying. So you think maybe it's addiction, but he's told you so much stuff that maybe you think it's also, maybe he's got some depression and this is how he's self-soothing, right? It's one of them. So I might say alcohol use disorder, and then in parentheses put provisional, meaning I think it's this, and I'm going to get some more information. Or maybe I'll say major depressive disorder, provisional, to see if there's enough information. And it might be that that person needed to warm up to me more. It might be that, we're human too. Maybe I didn't think at the time to ask this question, or maybe there's a better question to ask. But you don't, what I want you to take away with this is you don't need to hit the nail on the head immediately, right? You can work towards your diagnosis, and that's what you should do, right? You should keep track of symptoms and say, does this warrant a diagnosis? Look at those 4 Ps, look at the magnitude of the problem. And then say, I think I'm dealing with this, but I need to consult, I need to research, I need to ask my client for more information. So I'm going to put this for now. I'm going to put, substance use disorder unspecified, provisional, until I find more information to either help support the full version of the diagnosis or to help rule it out. So this is going to make some of you really uncomfortable. Diagnoses are not decided by the criteria, right? The DSM does not make the diagnosis. You make the diagnosis, right? And you are responsible for making the diagnosis and which one it is. We can, as I said in the other video, you can squint your eyes on almost any of these disorders and make yourself, here, I'm going to look at you while I say this. You can look at any of the disorders in here, right? And make it so that you fit it, right? So let's see. Oh, here's a good one. I'm going to ask you a few questions if you're okay with it. Have you ever had a large amount of food? Have you ever eaten more than you intended to eat? Did you feel like you couldn't stop eating? Like you ever just go through a bag of chips and just eat all of it? Have you ever eaten until you were uncomfortably full? Have you ever eaten when you weren't hungry? Have you ever felt bad about what you ate? You've got binge eating disorder then, right? So page 350 in your DSM if you want to look. So just because someone meets those criteria, because we can massage a person into them, doesn't mean that they automatically have the diagnosis, right? You give it. Now, here's the thing. If you wanted to give a diagnosis, like if there's part of me that says, hey, I think this client has binge eating disorder, I think they have alcohol use disorder or whatever it might be, then I am required to look in here, and to make the diagnosis, those criteria must be met, right? But it's not the other way around. I make the decision, and then I verify my decision with this. Just because someone met all the criteria in here, because they could meet the criteria for a variety of reasons, including I'm just not a very good counselor. Maybe I'm oversensitive to some of these diagnoses, and I'm kind of looking to fit people into them. So you are responsible for the diagnosis. You use the DSM as a tool. Oh, not me. We indicate the severity of the disorder. So this is one of the things that you might find frustrating with the DSM. There will be different types of specifiers on the diagnoses. Some have no specifiers, some have several. But one that we see often, though not on every single diagnosis, is severity, right? And there's different levels, like it's defined differently per diagnosis, but they typically have this pattern. You would say the person has a mild case if there are few symptoms other than the minimum. Severe if they have many, and then moderate is somewhere in between, which I know is not super helpful, but that's literally how they put it in the DSM, that mild, they have a few symptoms. Severe, they have several symptoms. Moderate is somewhere between mild and severe. Thanks. We also indicate where appropriate, like for example with eating disorders and substance use disorders, is the person in partial remission, right? Which means that they had the full diagnosis and now some of the symptoms have gone away. And full remission means that there are no more symptoms. And sometimes you document there's a prior history. This will all probably come together and tie very nicely together when we go over the pieces of a diagnosis. So that's it for right now. I hope that was helpful. If there's any confusion, let me know and I'll help you out. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope this first module was helpful and kind of set the stage for what we're going to do. In the next module, we start looking at the pieces of the DSM, the pieces of a diagnosis, and then how to record them. So how do you write it down, right? Because there's a system to that too. And then after that, we're just going through the DSM and looking at the different disorders, doing our case studies, quizzes, and exams. I hope everyone's well. I'll talk to you again soon.